perpetuates this kind of myth making about the hero.
Vision heroism. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Because, yeah.
hero is somebody who's like, doesn't
Mhm.
matter, go in there with
Yeah.
my guns, watching Sholay or any other things, two guys
Yeah.
going after 20 guys and, doing crazy things. I'm standing at the door watching this. He says, I'm sorry, I'm not signing it. He then leans back and pulls his blazer back and he's got a gun tucked in his waist. So I'm standing there thinking, oh my God, what should I do? Call the guard? Should I do this? Should I do that? My brain is like in overdrive. I'm 14-year-old, big kid, but he's the big man. The message I hope is hopeful that it's never too late for any of us to resource ourselves to be more bold in our lives.
Few thinkers bridge the worlds of business, psychology, and human behavior as seamlessly as Professor Ranjay Gulati, one of the most respected voices in global leadership today, a Harvard Business School professor, a social scientist, and best selling author. Professor Ranjay Gulati is with us here on Free Press Journal. Very good morning, and actually good evening from here, but thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I am very well, Afrida. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
It's my pleasure entirely. I'm very interested to know, Professor Gulati, about the book that you have written, which has created quite a buzz and is being spoken about a lot. But before I get to that, let me tell my viewers a little bit about you, that you're a Harvard Business School professor, a social scientist, best-selling author, and you have done pioneering work that focuses on unlocking organizational and individual potential, embracing courage, nurturing purpose, and purpose driven leaders is what I feel defines the sort of work that you have done. You're also the recipient of the 2024 CK Pralad Award for Scholarly Impact, and that was ranked as one of the top 10 most cited scholars in economics and business over a decade, I believe. So you have great credentials, and I'm just eagerly waiting to hear about all your thoughts that we would benefit from. But I want to begin by asking you that when you wrote a book on courage, how to be bold, was there a moment or an observation that first convinced you that bravery could actually be built like a skill?
So, the book actually, the the moment as I look back to my interest in courage was actually a moment of lack of courage on my part. I was 14 years old. My mother, at that time, this is the early 70s, had just started a business. She was a school teacher turned anthropologist turned businesswoman, and she had gone to Paris to convince a couple of fashion houses to buy her designs. She had figured out that Indian tribal women hand printed fabrics could be put on Western women clothes. This is way before garment industry took off or any of this happened. And she was very successful very quickly. And so she bought a piece of land outside Delhi, and what was became Gurgaon at that time, it was just farmland. And she was going to build a kind of home for herself, for her first kind of her home with the design studio and all that. And some developer decided he wanted that land and was harassing her to sell it to him. She was declining, and one day I was home from boarding school, and the guard came and said, "Somebody's insisting to see your mother. Can you talk to him?" So I went outside, big burly gentleman from the developer, saying, "I need to talk to your mom." And I said, "No, she's not going to see you." So he says, "Tell her 5 minutes, we'll never bother her again after this." So I went inside and said, "He's saying 5 minutes, never again." Comes in, sits down, puts a blank check and a piece of paper, says, "Ma'am, please sign this. We want to buy your land." "I've told you again and again, I don't want to sell the land, so please don't bother me." He gets belligerent. Says, "Ma'am, I'm not leaving here till you sign this document." I'm standing at the door watching this. He says, "I'm sorry, I'm not signing it." He then leans back and pulls his blazer back and he's got a gun tucked in his waist.
Right. Okay.
So I'm standing there thinking, oh my God, what should I do? Call the guard? Should I do this? Should I do that? My brain is like in overdrive. I'm 14-year-old, big kid, but he's the big man. My mother, without hesitation, leaps out of her chair, walks across the table to him, and slaps him across the face.
Oh,
How dare you come to my house? First, you try to bully me, and now you try to threaten me with a gun. Get out of my house. Now, it was a brilliant strategic move because in that commotion, the guard also came running in. This guy had no idea what hit him. He ran out of there so fast, he forgot his checkbook. Now, I was frozen. I just stood there thinking, what do I do? What do I was very ashamed of myself actually afterwards. It made me realize that some people are able to. And I asked her afterwards, I said, Mom, weren't you scared? She said, yes, I was scared. Yes, I saw the gun. But just because you're scared doesn't mean you do nothing. So it made me realize that courage is not the absence of fear, it's learning to take action in the face of fear.
Wow.
Somehow
Okay.
you have to become comfortable with fear. And this idea of finding comfort in dealing with fear was the kernel of the idea from where this book originated. Now, you may ask me, where does fear come from? And we can talk about how does fear originate, and then we can talk about how do we learn to cope with fear. Those are the central points of entry into discussing this book. That why do we feel scared, or when do we feel scared? And there's great
Yeah.
research on this.
Yeah, but don't you think, Professor Gulati, that this is something again very personality driven? I mean, even if you want to, I mean, we all have our innate nature, our intrinsic nature that is built into us. Not, are you telling me that this particular courage that you're calling it? You're saying that we have to take action in the face of fear is something that can be learned, acquired. Is it not something that is also built into our nature, into our DNA?
Okay, so some people are congenitally lucky. They are born
Hmm,
either
hmm.
fearless, they don't even feel fear, right?
Yeah.
There's very few of those. There's even considered to be a
Hmm,
syndrome, actually, of people who are actually fearless, but
hmm,
others who actually are somehow able to spontaneously deal with it. But let me give
hmm,
you an example of people everybody here in your
hmm,
listenership will have heard of is Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma
hmm,
Gandhi was a very shy, reserved man. He
hmm,
went to England to become a barrister. In the
hmm,
first court case hearing that he appeared for his client, he
hmm.
froze. He was unable to speak.
Okay.
The judge dismissed the case and told the client to go find another lawyer.
Hmm,
Now, this man somehow learned he hated public speaking. That's what he was
hmm,
terrified of public speaking. So here you have somebody who then transforms himself. And there are
hmm,
countless
hmm,
other examples, but that's just anecdotal.
hmm,
There is
hmm, hmm,
actually research to show that
hmm.
people can cultivate courage. They looked at this in the context of World War II, and they looked at bomb disposal squads and paratroopers in England, in the British Army, who trained to become courageous. To train, I've looked at the Marine Corps in the US, where the Marines
Yeah.
are trained to cultivate courage. So I think the message I hope is hopeful that it's never too late for any of us
Hmm,
to resource ourselves to be more bold in our lives.
hmm. What is the book, if someone's who's read the book or would want to buy the book, what is it that you would say something that would be of immense value when you want to build this particular trait? For example, say, since you gave the example of Mahatma Gandhi, and there are many who would relate to it and say, yeah, I'm one of those. So, what does the book do for such a person?
So, the first two-thirds of the book is really about how do you cultivate individual courage? How do you build
Okay.
confidence, right?
Hmm,
How do you build a support network that gives you even more, boosts up your courage, right?
hmm.
How do you navigate your way into uncertainty that you don't understand, one step at a time? So, the first, I would say, two-thirds of the book is really about individual courage. How can I resource myself to
Hmm.
face my fear, right?
Okay.
I have to submit, if I had read my own book and before I was in that moment in age 14, I think
Hmm.
I would have done something different. That's what I
Yeah.
think, right? So that's the
Okay.
first two-thirds. The last one-third is actually about
Hmm.
collective courage. How can I do that for my team, for my organization? In fact, I talk about the Taj Hotel over there and a number of other examples as well of where
Hmm.
you can build collective courage. So it's not just individuals, but also collective courage.
Yeah.
So, but I start at the individual level. That how can any one of us um, learn to live with fear? In fact, the problem I think we face is all the movies we watch, Hollywood and Bollywood, they
Hmm.
portray characters
Hmm.
who completely experience no fear when they're doing all these crazy things, and
Yeah.
it perpetuates this kind of myth making about the
There's
hero.
certain heroism. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Because, yeah.
hero is somebody who's like, doesn't
Mhm.
matter, go in there with
Yeah.
my guns. watching Sholay or any other things, two guys
Yeah.
going after 20 guys and, doing crazy things. So it creates this illusion that I'm not that.
Yeah.
I'm not that. In fact, Tom Cruise, from Mission Impossible, he does many
Hmm.
of his own stunts.
Hmm.
And after one of his last stunts in the previous Mission Impossible, where he drove a motorcycle off a cliff and parachuted
Hmm.
into the valley, he did it 6 times to get it right.
Hmm. Hmm.
And one of the reporters asked him, like, Tom, aren't you? And he doesn't have to do it. It's like he can have a stunt double do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
He says, aren't you scared doing this stuff? And Tom says, of course I'm scared doing it. He says, but you know something? I've learned to be okay with being scared. So
Mm-hmm.
one of my chapters is on the
Mm-hmm.
psychology of calm.
Hmm.
How do
Hmm.
people engage in emotional regulation? How do they calm themselves? There's a huge body of research in sports psychology, actually, on how athletes do this too, because one of the main reasons all top performance athletes have a psychologist with them is to help them keep emotionally calm in difficult situations.
Professor Gulati, I want to ask you on a very personal note as well that, overcoming fear is something a lot of people would be interested to know. Um, for example, on a personal note, like I said, I have a phobia for water. Like I can't get into a swimming pool. I fear, and I never learned swimming hence because the fear is so deep and intense. Does this book also talk about such fears and phobias? I mean, what is the spectrum you cover? And I also want you to talk about uh, perhaps a deviant, way of looking at courage is where you see a toxic masculinity, and there's lot of, since you spoke about Hindi movie heroism, earlier movies had a lot of that, was almost brandished as courage or bravery. So I want you to talk to us through this entire spectrum when you talk about boldness, courage, bravery, overcoming fear, etc.
Absolutely. The focus is on. So let's start with. I'll give you an example. Let me start with an example
Mhm.
to say individual courage.
Yeah.
So one of my chapters, which is actually called confidence, but I don't like that label anymore. I think it should have been
Hmm.
broader.
Hmm.
Starts with an experiment done by a Stanford psychologist named Albert Bandura. Albert was a very
Okay.
famous psychologist,
Hmm.
and Albert had the following idea. He was going
Hmm.
to teach students who were terrified of snakes
Okay.
to hold a snake.
Hmm.
People who are terrified of snakes, meaning they can't even be in a room with a snake, just like you're terrified of water, right?
Yeah.
They're called
Hmm.
ophidiophobes.
Okay.
So these ophidiophobes, he found
Hmm.
25 odd kids who were willing to be in this experiment. He told them what they were going to get paid to do this, but they were terrified of snakes. And
Hmm.
he was going to make them touch and hold what is called a corn snake. A corn snake, these are 6 feet long. They don't bite. They're
Hmm.
harmless in some ways, but they actually look terrifying. They're big. They're like a python.
Okay.
And in a matter of a couple of weeks, he had about half of these kids
Hmm.
touching and holding the snake and even
Wow.
putting it around themselves.
Huh.
The other half dropped out. Okay, so not everybody bought into his slow exposure therapy that he was trying to do. But what was
Hmm.
interesting was that the ones who did it not
Hmm.
only did it somehow did it, they experienced a general sense of self confidence about themselves in life. I can do it.
Hmm. Hmm.
What he called self efficacy, this kind of
Okay.
can do mindset. Now, if you look at some
Hmm.
entrepreneurs, they will struggle to do the business, they will have near failures, near bankruptcies, but they have this kind of can do mindset. So,
Hmm.
if if a person terrified of snakes can hold a snake, or even put it around their neck, so there are these kind of experiments and interventions that show that people are somehow able to tame their fear.
Okay.
And what are the ways by which we can do that? Cultivate,
Hmm.
because Afrida, one other separate body of research I talk about is regret. I talk about at the very
Hmm.
end. There's a great body of work on regret, which shows that when people look back at their lives, we have much greater regret about inaction than about
Hmm.
action. We regret things we didn't do
Hmm.
much
Hmm.
more than regret things we did do.
context, can I broaden our conversation a bit and come to the current dynamics of geopolitics? And if you like, what conforms to your definition of courage when it comes to leadership, say? There are, say, a bunch of 4 to 5 people, as we understand, who's deciding the fate of the entire population of this world at this point of time. Maybe not even four, maybe two or three. Uh, what conforms to your definition of courage and what deviates from it if you look at global politics, geopolitics, diplomacy?
So look, I first of all, my book is really about how to cultivate courage and not to judge people for courage.
Hmm,
And I try to wade away, steer clear of kind of controversy around this.
hmm,
But let's think about what courage historically has meant.
hmm,
Courage is about taking action in the face of
hmm,
fear
hmm.
for something that is a noble purpose to you,
Okay.
right? And
Hmm,
so it's around figuring out what are your, and this goes back to my previous book, which was about deep purpose.
hmm,
I think people who have a strong anchor and focus around a clear purpose of why they're here
hmm.
have an easier time being more bold
Okay.
because they stand for something, right? When you stand for something and believe in something, then it becomes easier for you to stand up for
Hmm,
your principles that you believe in, right? And that becomes whether you look at freedom fighters and things like that, or you look in geopolitics or elsewhere. I think part of the question we have to all ask ourselves is, what do I believe in?
hmm,
What's important to me?
hmm,
And is it something? And I also want to clarify that Aristotle, who wrote one of the earliest essays on courage, believe it or not, he wrote an essay on courage as well. And what he did was he had two extremes. One extreme was cowardice.
hmm,
The other extreme was not courage. The other extreme was reckless.
hmm,
And he put courage somewhere in the middle. So courage is also very deliberate, intentional, thought out. It's not just like I'm going to go into the clouds, into the fog with eyes closed. So it's deliberate, intentional action aligned with your purpose, even if it means dealing with fear. I'll give you a classic example of that, actually, which I use in my book. It
Yeah.
comes from another body of research by a famous University of Michigan professor named Carl Weick.
Hmm,
And Weick introduced this idea of sense making. He said, when you're operating in the fog, you don't know what's happening, you don't rush into the fog, you tiptoe your way into the fog. And the example he uses is firefighters. When firefighters go into a building on fire, they don't just
hmm,
charge in. You're first taking a visual cue outside. You're seeing how quickly is the building going to collapse. You're seeing, are there people who need rescue? You're seeing, are there combustible materials that might explode? And then
hmm,
you're walking in. As soon
hmm,
as you walk in, you gather more data. That data leads you to update your hypothesis. Then you go further in, and then you take further action, and then you adjust your action and course correct as you go. This is the way ancient mariners who didn't know the mapping of the world, they didn't just say, I'm sailing into the ocean, right? They said, let's go sail for 3 days to see if we hit land. We don't want to
hmm,
go more than 3 days. Let's go 4 days and see if we hit land. Let's go a little different direction because I'm not going to go 10 days and then try to come back 10 days and if I don't hit land. So people were very intentional about how they worked their way in. I One of the stories I document in my book is around the Fukushima plant that did not have a meltdown and how the plant manager took step by step to figure out how to fix it. This is the not the plant that had the meltdown. That is the Daiichi plant. This is the plant 8 miles away that saved themselves from having a meltdown. So in business today, like AI is big, right? Hot topic. Are you doing AI?
hmm,
Either you leap in there with all eyes closed, or you take a more deliberate, intentional path into it to
hmm.
understand how am I going to really benefit from my investments in AI. So part of our understanding of this uncertain world is, do you leap into a point of view and a course of action, or do you intentionally work your way into it?
And a couple of last few questions I have for you. You know, This is a question I have in my mind to ask you about. How do you view the current policies? I know you would not get into the politics of it, but I'm still curious to know that someone like you, who's a professor in Harvard Business School, who would have shaped brilliant minds, why do we notice sitting here now that there is now a tendency to undermine foreign entries to U.S. universities, despite the fact that Indian origin professors like you have contributed immensely, have rendered human service? Why suddenly do we see this resentment? Do you have anything in mind that you would like to share from your understanding of things?
I don't have an easy answer to that very difficult question.
I know.
Um, we're in a very polarized world today,
Mm,
where
mm,
people are unable to understand the nuances of the differences, which are much smaller. When we teach, what we teach, when we say in group, out group,
mm,
in group, out group is basically the question of where two groups of people who have different
mm.
points of view
Yeah.
exaggerate their understanding of the differences,
Wow. Okay.
right? And so we pull ourselves further apart than we actually even are.
Mm,
So this has been studied to death for decades, right?
mm,
That in the reason people get polarized is where small differences get exaggerated into very big differences, and then we
mm,
see the other side in very stark terms. And I think we have a moment in the world. It's not just in one place in the world, it's
yeah.
happening all over the
Mm,
world, where suddenly we are seeing others who are different from ourselves in very different ways,
mm.
and those
Is
differences
there
are
greater suspense and suspicion and mistrust?
it
You feel?
exaggerates our differences, right?
Mm,
The difficult question that happens is that we are unable to then have conversation,
yeah.
because
Yeah.
we have imagined our differences being insurmountable,
Mm.
and we are unable to have a dialogue across differences.
So you're saying it's a lot of it is delusional. It's not real. That's why you're saying it's
Uh,
imagine. It's
Delusional is,
imaginary.
is a loaded word, because it implies that the person is kind of a little off. I don't think they're off. It's human
Okay.
nature. This is what I think I've understood.
Mm,
You know, Let me go back to my book on courage. I read a
mm,
fascinating book by a historian.
mm,
Miller was his last name, on courage, and he
mm.
had a chapter in his book called "The Good Coward."
Okay.
Because and he was talking about this soldier in World War I who kept he would go to the front line, he would get scared and then run away, and then he'd come back and try again and run away again. He was
Mhm,
trying to fight, but he couldn't deal with his fear. But he's a good coward, he's a good guy, he didn't abandon. Many people just abandoned and ran away.
mhm.
So sometimes, we have human nature conditions that are not delusional. It's
Okay.
just part of normal human nature, like being scared in the face of uncertainty is normal. Similarly,
Mm,
seeing differences as exaggerated from what they actually may be is also normal. But we need to, once we understand it, maybe we can learn to overcome it. That's the idea. That's what
mm,
science can do for us, is shine the light on this kind of normal behavior that gets us in trouble,
mm,
and help us kind of work across. So whether it's bridging differences across different opinions, whether it
mm,
is about finding courage in the face of uncertainty.
mm,
So I
mm.
think there are these mind hacks that we
Yeah.
need to learn to do to ourselves sometimes, to overcome our not so not so good tendencies, if I may say.
Mhm. So, one last question about, since you talked about bridging differences, one of the things that is highlighted a lot about the economy, at least in India, and I think also in US, is that the income inequalities are huge. And do you think that can be corrected? That difference can be bridged? How can the skills that you espouse in your books help the process?
We have studied this and talked about this forever, right? There are many, Thomas Piketty talked about this more than a decade ago, right? About how income inequality is going to basically cause a lot of trouble in the world, which he was right.
Mm,
I think is that the here's something I don't know if courage can address income inequality, because I'm putting the burden on the people on the lower end. saying, you
Mhm.
go do it. And there are so many handicaps and barriers they have to face. And I don't want to in any way understate those barriers. And do think that we need to create opportunities for people who are not privileged and don't start their life in a more privileged place. So I don't want to take away from that at all. But
Mhm.
Maya Angelou, a famous American poet, once said, and she was paraphrasing Aristotle also, courage is the master virtue that unlocks all other virtues. And in some ways, it's easy for me to say from where I am, oh, go be courageous and you'll earn money and you'll be able to break your way out of it. But I do think we have to kind of, people need to be resourced and given the opportunity to find ways to act with courage. And I think that courage should not be just the purview of the rich and famous who can afford it, but it's something that could be a skill that everyone can use. If I look at entrepreneurs, one of the common themes among entrepreneurs who've leapfrogged their way out of their situations
Yeah.
is courage.
Yeah, I think beautifully said, and I'll take that line, which you just mentioned about how courage is the master skill, so to speak, of all the skills that you could acquire. And I would really love to read your book and, uh, gain some important insights. Thank you for joining us in this conversation, Professor Ranjay Gulati. Really appreciate your time. We will be airing the full interview this weekend, but I'll put out excerpts tonight itself. Thank you so much for joining
Pleasure,
us.
Afrida. Nice to talk to you. I really appreciate it, and you asked me some great questions, so forced me to think. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day.